Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so continuing our videos on the Justice League, one of the things that I realized going back and looking at the videos we've done is that we never covered issue number 18, which is one of the Legion of Doom tie-ins. One of the things to keep in mind for those of you guys who are new, the Legion of Doom tie-ins really focus on, of course, the Legion of Doom itself, but they basically take place outside of whatever's going on in the Justice League story. So it's really kind of its own self-contained series of events, which is cool because honestly, you could read everything that's been going on in Justice League so far and then read Legion of Doom later on, or at least read the totality and then read Legion of Doom later on. You kind of have to understand totality in order to grasp Legion of Doom. But for this comic, there's a little bit of explanation that we need to do here in order to make it make sense. And the reason why is because this just basically picks up with Lex Luthor essentially tapping into the mental remains, or I guess the physical remains and the mind of Brainiac. Now, Brainiac has a lot of different versions that exist over the course of DC Comics, right? There's Brainiac 4, Brainiac 5, there's the original Vril Dox from back in the day. This is basically the original one, right? Like Vril Dox 1, if that's what you want to call him. The way it was done in totality was actually changing things up a bit. And the reason why was because the original Brainiac was pre-Crisis, right? So it was kind of a chance for Scott Snyder to sort of do what he wanted to with the concept. But the idea was that much like the original Brainiac, this one was a collector of worlds, right? You know, kind of this retelling of the story. The Brainiac was a collector of worlds who would just travel around and literally collect like planets and things like that. And in fact, after the events of totality, we kind of saw that sort of play out in Justice League Odyssey, right? Where like all these worlds were kind of freed, and then the Guardians of the Universe and the Green Lantern Corps basically quarantined them off so nobody could get in, nobody could get out. And then that dealt with Darkseid and all that kind of cool stuff. But the idea here is that this version of Brainiac had essentially been killed. Now, in truth, the story of the totality and all the things that go into it, the Titans and all that kind of good stuff, that's really too much to cover in like a quick little intro spiel. So I invite you to check out the video. You'll find the link down in the description, which will explain the whole thing to you. But the overall gist of it was that basically this version of Brainiac was, his body was physically dead, but his mind was not. And the reason why this matters is because while Brainiac has historically been a pretty cool member and a pretty significant member of the Legion of Doom, the important thing to bear in mind here is that for what Lex Luthor's doing, which is to say, gaining as much information as he can about this artifact of the totality, in order to truly understand what's going on, he needs someone like Brainiac. And the reason why is because Brainiac had been around for so long, and he had explored so much of the universe. There's a lot of knowledge there. There's a lot of information there. And so in order to basically use him, or not really use him, but in order to gain access to that information and to have it benefit the schemes of Lex Luthor and to have Brainiac join the Legion of Doom, the idea is to bring him back. And the only way to really do that is to hook the two of them up mentally. And this is a very dangerous game because remember, Brainiac is a 12th level intellect. So stepping into that mind is stepping into a higher echelon of intelligence that it would seem Lex Luthor wouldn't really be prepared for. But that's one of the things that Scott Snyder really sort of toys with here, is that Lex Luthor is usually considered to be like one of the smartest men on the face of the earth. And so because of that, it's very difficult to like demonstrate intelligence, right? Like super strength, you can demonstrate that easily. Like Superman like punches an asteroid or something like that. It's difficult to demonstrate intelligence. And it's actually done extremely well here, but it really requires context. It requires you to know how smart Brainiac is. But with Lex Luthor basically diving into his mind and Brainiac saying like, welcome to this world, I'm going to take over your body and then I'm going to go forward and do villainous things, Lex Luthor immediately plays it smart. And that's why I say he's crazy intelligent. Is he on the same level as Brainiac? Well, of course not. I mean, the nature of Brainiac is to be that smart. It's just to be smarter than like every being in existence. But what Lex Luthor lacks here in intelligence in comparison to Brainiac, he makes up for with guile, stealth, and manipulation. And that's one of the reasons why Lex Luthor is such a cool character, because there's always a way for him to essentially win, right? So like an evil Batman, more or less. There's always a way for him to use his mind to win. But in this conversation with Brainiac, what Lex really does is play on the idea of there are things about this universe that you're not totally familiar with. And as a man or as a being who fancies himself on being an explorer and learning all things that are there, I got a text from Comic Story, it's important that you understand that we have to work together in this. And so what I'm going to do here is essentially spill the beans about everything, or at least about this little piece of the totality and how it ties into the bigger picture, which is kind of cool because this doorknob that Lex Luthor carries around has not been like full on totally explained by Scott Snyder. It's just there's this chunk of totality which has been careening through the universe and it's basically crashed on Earth, and like it's a means by which Perpetua is going to come back, and that's it. That's really all we ever really got. And then like we had this little doorknob and we didn't really know how this doorknob fit into the grand scheme of things outside of the fact that like it's somehow synonymous with the totality. And so kind of jumping back about 46,000 years in the past, as Lex Luthor tells this story to Brainiac, what we end up doing is picking up with Vandal Savage. Now, there's a reason why Scott Snyder does this. A lot of what Snyder has done has centered around Vandal Savage, right? Like Dionysium, the chemical that Joker consumes, that Ra's Ra's al Ghul consumes that kind of grants them immortality, or at least as long as they consume it, it grants them immortality. Vandal Savage was the first. He was the first one to consume the perfect version of Dionysium and gain actual immortality, meaning he couldn't really be killed by like disease or age or anything like that, but he could be killed by like having his head chopped off or something along those lines. But with Vandal Savage, remember, he was really kind of like the rise of like the first intelligent being out there, right? Because in his early days, he came into contact with a meteor. The meteor basically enhanced his intelligence, which brought him way beyond man as it existed at the time, which allowed him to kind of go forward as essentially a conqueror, right? And it's one of the things that's talked about here by Lex Luthor, that somewhere along the line, this little fragment, this doorknob, essentially as it is, or at least as it's been turned into, crashed on Earth in the form of like a small little piece of meteor. But when it came to Vandal Savage, he coveted power above all else. And so instead of taking this device and then in turn studying it and then kind of spreading it around the world, he kept it to himself. And so as he did that, he basically traveled around the world and basically, he came across all these various intellects, these various people from different points in time, all of whom were able to offer some tidbits of information or insight on what this piece of rock was. And the reality was that, of course, as it was kind of reshaped and remolded to essentially fit like a more modern depiction, which of course ended up being in the form of a doorknob, what Vandal Savage did is whenever anybody discovered something new about it, he would not tell them what had already been discovered. Instead, he would keep that information to himself. That way, he was the only one that had the full brunt of information regarding what this doorknob is and how it relates to the totality and the origin of the universe and all that kind of good stuff. And so as time progressed, eventually, he basically came upon a man named Lionel Luthor. Now, this is a very big deal. And the reason why is because Lionel Luthor, as he'd been depicted, of course, as the father of Lex and his sister Lena, was basically a guy who was, by all standards of measurement, a failure. Like, he never really left Kansas, never really done anything with his life. He beat the crap out of his kids because they were smarter than him. I mean, the guy had all kinds of different problems. What Scott Snyder does here is come back and change it all. He basically retcons everything. And what he says is that working alongside Vandal Savage, that Lionel Luthor was actually a genius. He was super intelligent. Now, something that I want to clarify here, and the reason why Scott Snyder can do this, is because when it came to the character of Lionel Luthor, in the New 52 landscape, he didn't show up until 2017, until Superwoman number 8, I think it was, when you got like the whole history between Lena and Lex and like all that kind of, or at least the history was built on, and then Lionel was basically brought in. Before that, he was pre-New 52, so he showed up basically after Crisis on Infinite Earths, and he was, again, like a total failure. So again, Scott Snyder can basically go through and do all this because he can kind of provide like this backstory that we didn't really have before, that we didn't really know about when it came to his character. And that's one of the important things, is that by studying this artifact, he basically learned a huge amount of information about the universe. Now, this is something that Snyder doesn't really seem to explain in the sense of like how this works. We don't really know if the information that Lionel Luthor gained from this artifact is a result of the fact that it had been traveling across the universe for so long and had essentially like reached Earth after like a huge amount of time had passed and all this information was imprinted as if it had just seen everything, or if these things about the universe were just ingrained as part of its inherent knowledge. That's not really given to us. And in reality, it doesn't really matter. The only thing that really matters is that we have this information now and we can kind of go forward accordingly. But it was Lionel Luthor who discovered the still force. It was Lionel Luthor who discovered like the emotional spectrum, or not really discovered it, but realized the emotional spectrum exists and the Guardians of the Universe are tapping into it and using it to create the Green Lantern Corps. It was Lionel Luthor who discovered all these different concepts and all these different things. A lot of the information that Scott Snyder's been building on and been using as part of his Justice League run, this new information or existing information, right? So like the events of the war with Atlantis, the whole like crazy conflict with the Dark Gods and all that kind of good stuff, all those things were basically built on, or at least discovered by Lionel Luthor somewhere along the line. He was very much a pioneer in that regard. Now, the cool thing about this is that he also sort of builds on the story between Lex Luthor and Martian Manhunter, which I'm not 100% sure that we covered. But what we end up learning here is that Lionel Luthor basically discovered that like Martians exist on Mars, and there's like extraterrestrial life. And so in an effort to understand how they work and what potential can be gained for humanity, he in turn started using Dr. Ertl, who was originally the guy who discovered Martian Manhunter in the really old 1950s, 1960s DC comics, and then basically had him start kidnapping Martians and bringing them in, which is how Martian Manhunter ended up on Earth in the DC universe as part of like this retold origin that DC released a little while ago. And so as a result of that, Lex Luthor, of course, basically helped Martian Manhunter to escape, but all these things root back to Lionel Luthor. He's a huge reason for why a lot of this information exists out there. The problem is that with a lot of the things that he was doing, especially performing experiments on Martians and white Martians and so on and so forth, what this led into was Vandal Savage discovering everything that he was doing. And that's when Vandal Savage basically confronted him and said like, why are you doing all this? And that's when it dawns on Lionel Luthor that Vandal Savage doesn't understand everything, that he doesn't grasp everything. For all the haughtiness that he puts on and all the glitz and glamour, in reality, the totality fragment won't show him anything. And so Lionel Luthor is really the only one who can actually see see what the bigger picture is. What this means, and to kind of explain this a little bit further, what this means is that for Vandal Savage, all he can do is see the different pieces people have gained and then put those pieces together. Lionel Luthor can actually see all the pieces they've gained and what the full picture should be on its base level, right? So like he truly understands what's going on here. All Vandal Savage knows is what he's been told. And so that's kind of the cool thing. That's kind of the cool little revelation, because in response to all this, Vandal Savage turns this guy's life upside down. And what he says is like, as far as the world is going to be concerned, we're going to change you, we're going to modify you. You're not going to have, any real recollection or anything. As far as the world is going to be concerned, you're going to be a failure of a man who lived in Kansas. And so basically it explains why Lionel Luthor appeared the way he did back in the days before the New 52. So it works exceedingly well. This is a perfect example of what DC's Rebirth Charter was, right? Like blending everything that worked with the New 52 with everything that worked before the New 52, combining these two elements together and basically creating a cohesive DC universe going forward. It's awesome. And it's a genius idea. And so that's when we kind of pick up with the part of the story where it's like, yes, Lionel Luthor was essentially a failure. He was a drunk. He never really seemed to amount to anything as far as the people in Smallville were concerned. The guy never really did anything with his life. And so that's when Lex sits down with Brainiac and says like, this is what we've learned from the totality fragment, but you have so much more knowledge about the universe itself. If we combine what we've learned so far with everything you know, then we'll have a whole new breadth of knowledge that we didn't have before. You guys understand why Brainiac is so essential for the plans of Lex Luthor, but also why Brainiac is such a valuable asset for anybody who's trying to understand the nature of the universe, because he's pretty much toured it all. And so it's a very cool concept, because in turn, where Brainiac intended to turn on Lex and then like take over his body, instead, Lex's argument is remove your emotional barriers, right? Like stop thinking so logically, start thinking emotionally, become essentially more human, or at least more organic and less computer, and then like we'll go forward from there. And Brainiac sides with him. And Brainiac says, yes, then we will do that. Like, I will do that with you. Of course, it's also revealed they have the remains of Perpetua, which is kind of a big thing. But it's like, join our cause, become a part of us, and together, like, we can usher in a whole new level of power, a whole new era. Now, this is big and this is important, because traditionally the Legion of Doom has always just kind of been like pennies. Nothing as like grandiose and cosmic in scope as this. The closest we ever got was like Infinite Crisis, with like, the multiple worlds and things like that. And that wasn't even really Lex Luthor. That was Alexander Luthor from a different universe. So it's cool to see this happen, because it really sort of builds up the Legion of Doom on like this huge cosmic scale and makes them a lot more dangerous and a lot more interesting than they've ever been before. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.